Now, if you're my age, I'm sure you remember the old Charlie Brown cartoons, right? You remember, Charlie Brown, you always, good grief, good grief, Charlie Brown. Well, and in many ways we hear that phrase, good grief, and it's kind of like an oxymoron, right? We think, can anything, good actually come from grief? Well, as one expert puts it, the grieving process is necessary because it's part of the healing process. That reminds us of what Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 4, when he said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And so it's like the comfort comes out of the grieving. It comes out of the mourning. And so this morning, as David grieves the loss of his son, we see both the good and the bad of grieving. So now with that, I want us to go back to the last verse of chapter 18 and also look again at the first 4 verses of chapter 19, where we see that David in many ways is going through the stages of grief. So now in chapter 18, David just gets the news that his son Absalom has been killed in battle. And now in verse 33 of chapter 18, it says, "And the king was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, he said, 'Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.' And it was told to Joab, chapter 19, verse 1, 'Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom.' So the victory that day turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard that day that the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in, who are ashamed as when they flee in battle. And the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, 'Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son.'" Now, as Kenneth Chafin put it in his excellent commentary, he said, "This chapter gives the reader an unforgettable picture of a broken-hearted father, a man to whom what was the best news to him as a king was the worst news to him as a father." So he hears that his enemy is dead, but he's hearing that his son is dead, and now he's grieving. And as a result, verse 3 says that the people stole into the city. Or as the New Living Translation puts it, it says they crept back into the town. And so really, the picture is that everyone is walking on eggshells. Everyone is afraid that whatever they do, whatever they say might trigger David. And so it's as if they're hanging their heads and they're sulking. In fact, if you didn't know any better, you would have thought that they were the ones who lost the battle. And so it's as if his grief is affecting those around him. Now, of course, we all know, the experts tell us that there are 5 stages of grief, right? In fact, if you're taking notes, let me give them to you. Stage number 1 is denial. Stage number 2 is anger. The 3rd stage of grief is bargaining. We're putting these up on the screen. And the 4th stage is depression. And the 5th and final stage is acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so we go through those different stages. There's denial. That feeling where you're numb, you're in shock, you're in disbelief. You just can't believe that this has happened. That's the denial stage. And then there's anger. Listen, death at first can seem so cruel and unjust and unfair, especially the death of someone who died way too early, way too young. And so when someone dies, it's common to feel angry. Now, we can feel angry even with the person who died. Feelings of, why did you leave me? We can feel angry with those that we think are responsible. Maybe the drunk driver, or maybe the medical professionals who we feel like didn't do enough, or whatever. But we can feel angry, and sometimes we can even feel angry with ourselves. Angry for the things that we did, or the things that we said, or the things that we wished we would have said, and we can be angry with ourselves. And then ultimately, we can even feel angry with God. Why did God allow this? How could God do this? And so there's denial, there's anger, and then stage number 3, bargaining. We start making deals with ourselves, or making deals with God. We promise to be a better person, or to give to charity. Or during the stage, we play the what if game. What if I'd gotten there sooner? Maybe this wouldn't have happened, or what if I would have done this, or what if I would have said that? And we go through all these different motions. And so we've got denial, we've got anger, we've got bargaining, and then there's depression. Being so enveloped with sadness and despair that we get to the point that we feel that life no longer has meaning without them in it. And we hit rock bottom. And then finally, we might come to the place of acceptance, where we finally get to this place where we accept what happened. Listen, it doesn't mean that we got over them, because we don't get over people we love. We don't move on from the people that we love, but we can move forward. C.S. Lewis, when he lost his wife, he wrote these words. He said, "Losing a loved one is like having your leg amputated. You don't get over having an amputated leg. The wound may heal, but the leg will never come back. You'll always have the absence in your life, and you'll always walk with a limp." And that's where we stand. We have this absence, we have this void, we have this pain, we have this hurt, but we can move forward. And so David's kind of going through this. Now, by the way, I might point out that the stages of grief are not linear, meaning that it's not like we progress from one stage to another stage and graduate from this stage to that stage. If anything, it's more like circular. It's like you go through it and it happens, and then you get this stage, and all of a sudden you're back to this stage, and you go over to this one, and it's more circular. In fact, for some people, they don't even experience all 5 of the stages. But what's clear as we read this passage this morning is that David is clearly going through the stages of grief. So in chapter 18, he gets the news that his son is dead, and it's almost like there's shock as he cries out, "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And then in chapter 18, verse 33, at the end, he says, "Would that I had died instead of you." It's like now he's in this bargaining stage where he's wishing that somehow he could have taken Absalom's place. It could have been him instead. And now in chapter 19, it seems like he's bouncing back and forth between depression and anger to the point that his own people now are walking on eggshells. But what's interesting is that earlier, back in chapter 12, you may remember when David lost his baby with Bathsheba, he seemed to reach a place of acceptance. I say that because in chapter 12, verse 23, David says, "I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." In effect, he's saying, listen, I understand that I can't bring him back, but I also know that I'm going to see him again. I'll see him in heaven. He's come to this place of acceptance. He's dead. I can't bring him back, but I also know I'm going to see him again in heaven. But with Absalom, instead, he seems to be shifting back and forth, as we said, between anger and depression, but there seems to be no acceptance. Now, J. Vernon McGee points out in his commentary that perhaps another reason David grieved differently for the baby that he lost with Bathsheba versus how he's grieving over Absalom is because in one sense, he knew where the baby would spend eternity. He knew that he would see that baby again in heaven. But based on Absalom's rebellion, based on the fact that Absalom had earlier murdered his half-brother Amnon, and based on Absalom's current anger and bitterness, perhaps David wasn't sure he would see Absalom again. Perhaps he wasn't sure if Absalom was going to go to heaven. And that made this hard to accept. It made it hard to come to a place of acceptance. And so we see David going through the different stages of grief, but as we pick it up in verses 5 through 7, now it's as if he gets stuck in his grief. Verse 5, "Then Joab came to the house of the king, and he said to him, 'You have today covered with shame the faces of your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have today made it clear that the commanders and the servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, that you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out, speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now.'" Now, we all know, and we've heard it said, that grief is a process, right? And everyone goes through that process differently. We all grieve differently. But listen, for some of us, that process lasts longer than it does for others. But there are cases where sometimes grieving can border on being unhealthy. Where we get so consumed by grief that we're almost paralyzed by it. We get so consumed by grief that we almost become a detriment to others around us. Now listen, in 31 years of full-time ministry, I've seen example where maybe it's somebody who loses a spouse, maybe a husband loses his wife, and he becomes so consumed by the grief that he stops working, he can't get out of bed, he stops taking care of the kids, maybe even turns to drugs to kind of cope with the pain. But as he's kind of in this downward spiral, then all of a sudden social services get involved and they remove the kids, and it's just one thing after another. And so I've seen case after case, I've seen different versions of that same story in 31 years where it's as if we get so consumed by our grief that we literally become a detriment to those around us. And in some cases, that's where David might be right now. Now listen, David understandably is hurting. David understandably is grieving. But Joab, and by the way, Joab's not perfect in this. We're going to see that the next time as we finish chapter 19. But in this case, Joab, he understood the urgency of the situation. As he comes in verse 7 and he says to David, arise. He says, if you don't go out there, then the people aren't going to stay with you. Now, in this case, I think Joab was right. Because in effect, Joab was saying, listen, David, if you keep sulking like this and keep going on like this, you're going to lose everyone. He's like, listen, when Absalom recruited practically the entire nation against you, these were the ones who stayed loyal to you. These were the ones who fought for you. I mean, when your own son had forsaken you, these were the ones who delivered you from the jaws of death. And in fact, David, the truth of the matter is that if this had been any other enemy other than your own son, you would have been rewarding them for their faithfulness to you. But here you are. Instead, everyone's walking around in eggshells. They're afraid to do the wrong thing. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid if they say the wrong thing, there might be hell to pay. And David, if you keep going on like this, you're going to lose everyone. And frankly, Joab was right. This reminds us of Proverbs 27, verse 6, that says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Reminding us that our friends tell us the truth even if it hurts, whereas our enemies, they'll hurt you even if they have to lie to do it, even if they have to pretend to be your friend. And so Joab was faithful, although not perfect, and we'll see that next time, but in this case, he told David what he needed to hear. So David's going through the stages of grief. He seems to get stuck in his grief, and Joab now comes and tells him to get up. Arise. And now as we pick it up in verse 8, the first part of verse 8, we see that's what happens. David gets up. Verse 8, then the king arose and took his seat in the gate. Let's pause here. Now listen, can I say that sometimes in order to move on, we need to move forward. In order to move on, we need to move forward. Now listen, that doesn't mean, as I said before, that doesn't mean that we stop loving them, but it does mean that we don't have to stop living. Sometimes the first step toward healing is to actually take the first step. And so on that note, Joab now turns to David and he says, arise, get up, go out there and talk to the people. In effect, he's saying, David, look, get up, get back to work, get back to the routine of being the king, leading the people. Get up. And by the way, it's basically the same advice that God had given to Elijah a little bit later on. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we read this time where Elijah is having the famous showdown between him and the prophets of Baal. And he challenges them. He says, listen, I want you to call on your gods, and I'll call on my God. And the real God will send fire from heaven and consume this sacrifice that's on this altar. So the prophets of Baal, they start calling out to their gods, they're chanting, they're singing, they start cutting themselves, and yet nothing's happening. So Elijah starts mocking them. He's like, well, maybe your God's busy. And by the way, the Hebrew language is a little more coarse. The Hebrew language is literally saying, maybe your God is on the pot. He's on the toilet. He's a little indisposed and he can't deal with you right now because he's got his own problems. So he's mocking them. And then it's Elijah's turn, and he calls on his God, and God sends fire down from heaven. It consumes the sacrifice and the altar and everything around it. And on that instant, all of the prophets of Baal are killed instantly on the spot. It was an amazing victory. But then all of a sudden, the very same Elijah who just called fire down from heaven, all of a sudden runs off like a scared little schoolgirl when he finds out that Queen Jezebel wants to kill him. So he goes and he hides in a cave. And he's chronically depressed. And he cries out to the Lord. And he says, Lord, just take my life now. I'd be better off if I was dead. He's basically suicidal. And now it's at this point that the Lord starts to minister to him. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 7, and it says, and the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. And basically, the angel tells Elijah to do the same thing Joab told David to do. He says, arise, get up. Now, the angel tells Elijah to go to Mount Horeb and wait for the voice of the Lord. And so there's this great wind, but the Lord wasn't in it. There's a great earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in that. Then there's a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And then there was a still small voice, and that was the voice of the Lord. And listen, you and I, in our times of despair, in our times of grief, in our times of depression, we need to seek the still small voice of the Lord. But listen to this. Oftentimes, the key to finding the still small voice of the Lord starts with getting up, starts with doing the next thing. You get up even though you don't feel like getting up. You eat something, you feed the kids, you get back to work, but you do the next thing. And as you do, eventually you come to a place where God starts speaking to you. You start hearing his voice again, that still small voice. I like how Elizabeth Elliot put it. Now, if you don't know Elizabeth Elliot, her husband Jim Elliot was martyred as he was a missionary serving for the Lord to a tribe in Ecuador called the Auca Indians. And he was killed. He was martyred for his faith. And Elizabeth Elliot said that there was a line in a poem that helped her move forward after the loss of her husband. The poem reads this, and it says, do it immediately, do it with prayer, do it reliantly, casting all care, do it with reverence, tracing Christ's hand, who placed it before you with earnest command, stayed with omnipotence, stayed beneath his wind, leave all resultings, do the next thing. That's what we need to do. And as we do the next thing, as we get up and we get moving, that's often where we find the healing. That's often where the Lord starts ministering. That's where he starts speaking in that still small voice. So David's going through the stages of grief. He seems to get stuck in his grief. Joab tells him to get up. David now gets up, and as we finish verse 8, now David is back where he belongs. Let's look at verse 8 again. Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, behold, the king is sitting in the gate. And all the people came before the king. So again, David's back where he belongs. He's back in sitting in that place of authority, sitting at the gate of the city, sitting in that place where the people would bring their legal disputes and bring their cases to be settled by the king. And as he comes and he sits, now a message goes out to all the land telling the people basically that, you know what, all their sacrifice was worth it. All their effort, everything they gave up, everything that they went through, it was all worth it because the king is back where he belongs. And so this morning we've seen David kind of go through some of the stages of grief. There's shock, there's denial, there's going back and forth between depression and anger. There's being so consumed by grief that he's almost paralyzed by it, and it's affecting others around him as they're walking on eggshells. And yet now finally he's back where he belongs, sitting in that place of authority. Listen, that doesn't mean that he stopped loving Absalom. That doesn't mean that he moved on from Absalom, because as we said before, we don't move on from the people we love. We can, however, move forward. Grief counselors sometimes talk about the 3 N's of grief. The 3 N's of grief. Letter N, the 3 N's. And number 1 is normal. Listen, it's normal to be deeply affected when you lose someone you love. That's normal. Number 2, natural. Listen, when you love deeply, it's natural to grieve deeply. That's natural. And number 3, necessary. The grieving process is necessary. Why? Because the grieving process leads to healing. However, grief experts warn us, saying that avoiding and ignoring grief can make it last longer and make it even more painful. So we can't avoid it. We can't put it off. We can't turn away from it because it's necessary. It's necessary to bring the healing. Even as Jesus said in Matthew 5:4, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Read a story of a guy in Florida who was driving home from work, and suddenly as he's driving home, a huge sinkhole opened up and swallowed his whole car. Now, he didn't get hurt, but he was dazed and confused, and he didn't know where he was or what had happened. As he put it, he says, 1 minute I was driving in my neighborhood on a bright sunny day in Florida, and the next minute I'm in the bottom of a deep dark hole, and I felt like the whole world was caving in around me. And frankly, that's how many people feel when they've been hit by the loss of a loved one. I mean, 1 minute life is fine. 1 minute you're with them and you're talking with them and you're spending time with them, and the next minute they're gone. And suddenly it's like your whole world is crashing in around you. It's like you've been swallowed up by a sinkhole. I often hear from people that are grieving. They say things like, I just feel completely numb. It's like everything's just going in slow motion. It's like I'm on autopilot. You often hear words like dazed, confused, bewildered, paralyzed, surreal. I'm in a state of denial, a state of shock. I can't believe they're gone. This must be some mistake. And oftentimes they'll swear that they still see them. They'll swear that they still hear their voice. And all of that is normal. That's all a part of the grieving process. Grief counselor Ken Hawk said, "Shock is a built-in response to the loss of a loved one. It can even be a blessing because it cushions us against the blow by blocking some of the emotional pain until we're more ready to handle the full impact of our loss." And so this morning, we see David go from shock, denial, as he's crying out, "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son," there's this sense of disbelief. And as I said, it's circular. You don't progress from one stage to another because he comes back to that repeatedly. There's a sense of shock. And then there's bargaining. "I wished it was me instead of you." And then there's anger. Everyone's walking on eggshells. And by the way, speaking of anger, Christian counselors say that the 3 most common targets of our anger when we lose someone are, number 1, the loved one who died, number 2, ourselves, and number 3, God himself. We lose someone and we get angry, and maybe number 1, we get angry at the loved one who died. There's a grieving wife who admitted that she was angry at her husband for leaving her. Now, she knows he didn't leave her. She knows he died, but that's how she feels, and she's angry. There's a grieving father who's angry at his son because he was behind the wheel speeding when he died in the car accident. And he's angry, thinking, if you wouldn't have been driving, or at least driving so fast, you would still be here. You'd still be alive, and he's angry. So we get angry sometimes with the one who died. Sometimes we get angry with ourselves. Maybe we get angry because of the last thing that happened or the last thing that was said. Maybe we had an argument or we said some words we can't take back, and now we're angry with ourselves. And then what's really common is we get angry with God. Why would God take them from me? How could God allow this to happen? Now, there are some who feel that grief actually drew them closer to God, and they say things like, my faith was the only thing that kept me going in that dark time. But there are many, many, many others who were once close to God, and yet now they're so devastated by the loss of a loved one and so shaken by it that they feel that even God himself has abandoned them. And there's others that are just, quite frankly, just angry at God. How could God let this happen? Why did he take them from me? And maybe you're here this morning, and maybe you're grieving, and maybe this is where you are. Maybe you're still angry. And maybe the anger fluctuates. Maybe you're angry at them. Maybe you're angry at yourself. Maybe you're angry at God. And if that's the case, listen, I want to encourage you, first of all, to be honest with God. Pour out your heart to God. Listen, 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you." Or as Philip Yancey in his book Disappointment with God put it, he says, One bold message in the book of Job is that you can say anything to God. Throw at him your grief, your anger, your doubt, your bitterness, your betrayal, your disappointment. He can absorb them all. Or as counselor Justin Schutler put it, your pain, your anger, your doubts, your fears, none of those are too much for God to handle. So therefore, as it says in 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And by the way, can I tell you something? Can I just tell you that God's angry too? Here's why I say that. In John chapter 11, we read the time that Jesus' friend Lazarus died. And Jesus comes on the scene, and when he shows up, Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, are weeping. And so in John chapter 11, verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her were also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, draw your attention to that phrase, deeply moved in his spirit. Now, you and I would read that he was deeply moved with compassion or deeply moved with sorrow, deeply moved by grief. Did you know that the original Greek word that's used there literally means deeply moved by anger? They're weeping, and he's deeply moved by anger. Now, what in the world would he be angry with in that moment? Now, this is just my opinion, but in my opinion, I think in that moment he was angry with death. Did you know that death is God's enemy? 1 Corinthians 15:26, the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. Death is God's enemy. Listen, God originally, when he created everything, he did not create death. When he created mankind to live forever, to live for eternity, walking with him in fellowship with him. God did not create death. Death came because of sin. It was a result of Adam's sin. Romans chapter 5 tells us through one man, death and sin entered the world. And death is God's enemy. So let me ask you, has someone died? And has it made you angry? Are you still angry? Can I tell you that the Lord shares your anger because his enemy killed your loved one? It's his enemy. And yet sometimes what happens is we misplace our anger. And as I said, we get angry maybe at the loved one who died. Or we get angry at ourselves, or we get angry at the medical professionals because maybe they didn't do enough, or we even get angry at God because he didn't answer our prayers. He didn't show up. He didn't intervene. Now the Bible says, be angry, but it goes on to say, and do not sin. And so listen, it's okay to be angry when you lose a loved one because God himself is angry. That's his enemy. But I want to encourage you to direct your anger in the right direction. Listen, it's not the medical professionals. They're not your enemy. God's not your enemy. Death is your enemy. And can I tell you there's coming a day that death will get what it's got coming? Because 1 Corinthians 15:26 says the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. The enemy that killed your father, the enemy that killed your mother, the enemy that killed your aunt and your uncle, that killed your best friend, that killed your neighbor, that killed your child, that enemy is going to get justice. It'll get what it deserves. You will be avenged. Now, if you're here and you're grieving, I want to leave with you as we close some resources. Up on the screen, we have some different resources. First of all is a support group called Grief Share. Just scan this QR code, and that'll take you immediately to a Grief Share support group. And it's a national organization, but there's a Grief Share support group near you. There's one right here in Brighton. And I would encourage you to get some fellowship. What you need in this time is not to be alone. You don't need isolation. You don't need to be by yourself. You need the body of Christ. Hebrews says, let us encourage one another daily as long as it's called today. Get into some fellowship with other people who know what shoes you're walking in. Find a Grief Share support group. Then there's a couple of books that I'll refer you to. The first is by Pastor Ed Taylor, pastor of Calvary Aurora. He wrote a book a while back titled God's Help for the Troubled Heart. He wrote this book shortly after the death of his 26-year-old son, Eddie. And then there's a book by Pastor Greg Laurie titled Hope for the Hurting Heart. An excellent book that Greg wrote when his son, Christopher, died in an automobile accident. But get these resources. Reach out. Get the help that you need so that you can grow, so that you can progress, so you can get to a place where you find healing and health as you go through this process. But remember, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Amen? So, Father, we thank you. We thank you for your word. We thank you that your word is like a salve, like an ointment that ministers, that heals. Lord, sometimes you expose sin, and other times you expose hurt. But it's all for the process of working your will in your way into our hearts so we can grow and move forward in you and for you. So we thank you this morning in Jesus' name. Let's worship the Lord.